The Karsden mountain range had killed better men than those who stood shivering in its shadow tonight. Wind screamed through the valley at 70 kilometers per hour, carrying snow so dense it turned the world into a white void. Temperature gauges read -32 and dropping. The kind of cold that turned moisture in your lungs to ice crystals, that made rifle bolts stick, that transformed simple tasks into battles against your own freezing body. Lieutenant Commander Jackson Ward lowered his thermal scope and cursed under his breath. 3,800 meters. The distance between his position and the fortified ice structure on the opposite peak might as well have been 3,800 miles. Wind still gusting, his spotter, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Flynn, reported. His voice crackled through the comm system, barely audible over the howling storm. 60 to 70 clicks. Variable layers. Thermal inversion at 2,000 meters. Jackson knew what that meant. The bullet would have to travel through multiple wind layers, each moving at different speeds and directions. Add in the Coriolis effect, the extreme cold affecting powder burn rate, and the sheer distance. It was a shot that pushed beyond the edge of what physics and human capability allowed. SEAL Team Frost 7 had been inserted into these mountains 48 hours ago with a single objective: eliminate the command structure of an extremist cell that had somehow carved out a fortress in this frozen hell. Intelligence indicated 14 high-value targets currently sheltering in that ice structure, waiting out the storm before moving to a more defensible position. The window was closing. In 7 hours, maybe less, they'd be gone. Jackson had already burned through 8 rounds, trying to zero in on the first target. Every shot had missed wide, some by 2 meters, some by 5. The wind drift alone was catastrophic. At this range, even a 5-kilometer-per-hour crosswind could push a bullet several feet off course. With gusts hitting 70, the math became impossible. Reynolds, Jackson called to his lead sniper. Your turn. Staff Sergeant David Reynolds had made confirmed kills at 2,400 meters in Iraq. He was Frost 7's best long-range shooter. He settled into position, controlled his breathing, made micro-adjustments to his scope. The custom 338 Lapua Magnum rifle had been specially modified for extreme cold-coated bolt. Reinforced barrel, powder loads calibrated for low temperatures. The shot cracked across the valley. Jackson tracked the thermal bloom through his scope, watching the bullet's path bend and curve through the invisible rivers of wind. It impacted 6 meters left of the target, punching harmlessly into ice. Wind shear's too complex, Reynolds said, frustration edging his normally calm voice. I'm reading 3 different wind speeds between here and target. The thermal layers acting like a wall, bullets tumbling through the transition. Jackson checked his watch. 0347 hours. In 3 hours, dawn would break. The extremists would move. Mission failure. Sir, Flynn said quietly, we could request an airstrike. Negative. Storm's too heavy. No aircraft can operate in this. Jackson stared at the distant structure through the scope. Thermal signatures showed figures moving inside, oblivious to the failed attempts on their lives. And even if they could, these mountains would turn the blast radius unpredictable. Civilians in the valley below. The wind gusted harder, shaking the camouflaged hide where Frost 7 had established their position. Snow accumulated on every surface. Ice formed on exposed metal. This wasn't just a shooting problem, it was a survival problem. Much longer in this cold, and the team itself would become casualties. There's one option, said Lieutenant James Garrett, the team's tactical officer. His voice carried a weight that made Jackson turn. Aria Hale. The name landed like a stone. Hale? Reynolds scoffed. She hasn't been in rotation for 18 months. Medical discharge after that incident in... She's been reinstated, Garrett interrupted. Quietly, she's actually stationed 40 clicks south, Mountain Warfare Training Facility. Jackson knew the name. Everyone in the special operations community knew Aria Hale. The woman had set records that still stood confirmed kills at ranges that made other snipers shake their heads in disbelief. Her longest confirmed hit was 3,200 meters, made in the Hindu Kush, under conditions almost as brutal as these. But she'd also been the center of a controversy that nearly ended her career. A winter operation gone wrong. A teammate dead. Investigations, hearings, medical evaluations. The official record said equipment failure. The unofficial whispers said something else, that Hale had relied on instinct over data, and someone had paid the price. She was discharged because she couldn't handle winter operations, Jackson said. Psychological trauma. Why would we bring her into this? Because she's the only person alive who might make this shot, Garrett replied. And because the discharge was political, not medical. She passed every eval. They just needed someone to blame. The wind howled. The clock ticked. Jackson weighed options that all felt like failures. Get her here, he said finally. But if she can't make it happen in 1 hour, we extract and scrub the mission. The helicopter couldn't land, so Arya Hale rappelled from 30 feet up, boots hitting the snow with practiced precision. She moved through the storm like she'd been born in it, economical movements, no wasted energy, reading the terrain with the kind of awareness that separated survivors from casualties in mountain warfare. Jackson watched her approach the hide. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'6", lean build, but she carried her gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Her face was partially obscured by cold weather gear, but her eyes were visible. Pale gray, the color of winter sky. Scanning the position with clinical assessment. Lieutenant Commander Ward, she said, voice clear despite the wind. Not a question. She'd already identified the chain of command. Miss Hale, thanks for coming. Jackson gestured to the setup. We're looking at 3,800 meters, sustained winds, 60 to 70 clicks, multiple thermal layers. 8 shooters have tried. 0 hits. Arya moved to the spotting position without responding. She didn't touch the rifle. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook, actual paper, not a digital device, and began writing. Jackson caught glimpses of sketches, wind patterns, elevation diagrams, calculations that looked more like physics equations than shooting solutions. Wind shear at what altitude? She asked. 2,000 meters, Flynn answered. Thermal inversion creating a boundary layer. Pressure gradient? Dropping. Storms intensifying. Arya nodded, still writing. Jackson exchanged glances with Reynolds, who looked skeptical. Ma'am, Reynolds said, his tone carefully neutral. We've already run the ballistics. The shot's not possible in these conditions. Wind variation's too extreme. Arya finally looked up from her notebook. You ran ballistics assuming stable air mass. But air isn't stable in a mountain storm. It's laminar flow with turbulent boundaries. You're not shooting through wind, you're shooting through rivers of wind. Different densities, different temperatures, all moving at different speeds. That's exactly why it's impossible, Reynolds replied. No. Arya's voice was soft but absolute. That's why it requires a different approach. She moved to the primary rifle position, examining the weapon Reynolds had been using. Her fingers traced the barrel, the scope mounts, the bolt mechanism. This won't work. That's a custom. 338 Lapua, Reynolds said. Defensive now, top-tier build, sub-MOA accuracy. At normal ranges, yes. But at 3,800 meters in these conditions, the barrel harmonics will be wrong. You need a heavier profile to dampen vibration in this wind, and this powder load she ejected around, examined it too slow. It'll lose velocity through the thermal layer. Jackson felt his team's skepticism turning to something else, not quite belief, but attention. You keep a 416 Barrett in your inventory? Arya asked. We do, Jackson confirmed. Why? Heavier bullet, better ballistic coefficient, won't drift as much. She was already moving, pulling gear from her pack. I'll need to swap the scope. Mine's calibrated for extreme cold. Different reticle system. As she worked, Flynn leaned toward Jackson. Sir, is she serious? The 416 has more recoil, harder to spot your own shots. I don't need to spot them, Arya said without looking up. She'd heard despite the wind. The first round will tell me everything I need to know about the wind pattern. After that, it's just reading the changes. Reynolds laughed sharp, bitter. You're talking about making 14 headshots at 3,800 meters in a Category 9 blizzard by reading wind changes. That's not marksmanship. That's fantasy. Arya finished mounting her scope and finally looked at Reynolds directly. February 2023. You made a shot at 2,400 meters in Anbar Province, 17 km/h crosswind. You held 4 mils right and made the shot on your 3rd attempt. You're a good shooter. Reynolds blinked, surprised she knew his record. But you're thinking like a technician, Arya continued. Wind isn't an equation, it's a living system. You can't calculate it, you have to listen to it. She pulled a small device from her pocket, looked like a modified anemometer, but with additional sensors Jackson didn't recognize. What's that? He asked. Custom build. Measures wind speed, but also harmonics. The sound wind makes when it moves through terrain creates patterns. Like music, each mountain, each valley has its own signature. She held it up, let it sample the howling storm. Right now, the primary wind is northwest at 65 clicks. But there's a secondary current northeast, 40 clicks hitting at 1,800 meters, and a thermal updraft from the valley creating a third layer at 2,200 meters. Flynn checked his instruments. That's accurate. How did you practice? Arya was setting up now, positioning the rifle, adjusting the bipod legs to account for the snow depth. I spent 2 years in these mountains after my discharge. Couldn't sleep, couldn't stay away from the cold, so I learned it instead. Every wind pattern, every thermal current, every way the air moves when temperature and pressure and terrain collide. She paused, and for the first time, Jackson saw something beneath the clinical precision. Pain, old and deep. After what happened to Nathan, she said quietly, I promised I'd never trust equipment over instinct again, so I stopped using computers for wind calls. I learned to read it the way people did for thousands of years before we had technology. By feel, by sound, by understanding that the wind isn't your enemy, it's just another variable you can learn to predict. The silence that followed wasn't skepticism anymore. It was something closer to reverence. You've got 1 hour, Jackson said. After that, we extract. Arya settled into position, her breathing already slowing into the meditative rhythm of a prepared shooter. I'll need 7 minutes, she said, not an hour. The window's shorter than you think. Arya's first action surprised everyone. She pulled out the loaded magazine and inspected each round individually, weighing them in her gloved hand, checking the bullet's seating depth with a small gauge. Ammunition weight variance, she explained, setting aside 3 rounds. These are 0.4 grains heavier. At 3,800 meters, that's a 15-centimeter difference in point of impact. Reynolds moved closer, despite himself, professional curiosity overriding his skepticism. You can feel 0.4 grains difference? No. But I can see the seating depth variation. Heavier bullets sit slightly deeper, changes the powder compression. She selected 5 rounds, arranged them in specific order. These will be my first sequence. Matched within 0.2 grains, she loaded them carefully, then made a series of adjustments to the scope that seemed to violate everything Jackson knew about long-range shooting. 12 mils of adjustment, massive compensation that would normally send rounds sailing over any target. Walk me through it, Jackson said. Not a request. Arya didn't look away from the scope. The bullet will drop approximately 42 feet over 3,800 meters in standard conditions. But these aren't standard conditions. The cold air is denser, that actually reduces drop slightly, maybe 39 feet. But the thermal inversion will create a boundary where the bullet transitions from cold, dense air to slightly warmer, less dense air. That's where the trajectory gets complicated. She adjusted the parallax on her scope, fine-tuning the focus. When the bullet hits that thermal boundary at around 2,000 meters, it'll experience a sudden change in air density, like punching through a wall. The trajectory will flatten for a brief moment, then resume normal drop. Most shooters don't account for that. They see the bullet rise unexpectedly and think they miscalculated. Flynn was taking notes now, his earlier doubt replaced by the eagerness of someone learning from a master. Then there's the Coriolis effect, Arya continued. At this latitude and range, the Earth's rotation will push the bullet approximately 8 inches right. In normal conditions, you dial that in and forget it. But in a mountain storm, you've got the Yachtfos effect, complicating things. The wind is moving east to west, same direction as Earth's rotation, which either amplifies or reduces Coriolis depending on the exact wind angle. How do you calculate that in real time? Reynolds asked, his skepticism cracking. You don't, you feel it. Arya made a final adjustment, then settled into shooting position. The calculations give you a starting point, but the actual shot requires you to integrate 1,000 variables your conscious mind can't process. Wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the harmonic frequency of the wind, the way snow crystals in the air create microturbulence. She exhaled slowly, her breath creating a thin fog in the frigid air. Your brain is the most sophisticated ballistic computer ever created. But only if you trust it. Only if you feed it enough experience to build accurate, predictive models. I've made 10,000 shots in conditions like this. My subconscious knows things my conscious mind hasn't figured out yet. Jackson found himself believing her. Not because her explanation made complete sense, parts of it sounded more like mysticism than marksmanship, but because of the absolute certainty in her voice. She wasn't hoping to make this shot. She knew she could. "The wind's shifting," she said suddenly. "Storm's changing direction, northwest to north-northwest. This is the window." "How do you know?" Flynn asked. "Listen." They all fell silent. At first, Jackson heard only the chaos of the blizzard. But then, underneath it, he caught what Arya meant, a change in pitch. Subtle, but distinct. The howl had shifted from a higher frequency to something deeper. The wind was rotating. 60 seconds, Arya said. "The shift will stabilize for about 90 seconds, then the turbulence will increase again. I need to make the first shot in the next minute." Her breathing had already shifted into the slow, controlled rhythm. 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, heart rate dropping, body becoming a stable platform. "Ranging?" she asked. 3,847 meters. Flynn confirmed, reading the laser rangefinder. "Wind? Primary northwest, 6 to 3 clicks. Secondary northeast, 4 to 2 clicks at estimated 1,800 meters. Arya made a final microscopic adjustment to her scope. Her finger touched the trigger, taking up the slack. The rifle seemed to become part of her, not a tool she was using, but an extension of her own body. "Firing!" she whispered. The shot cracked across the valley. The recoil was massive. 416. Barrett hitting back with nearly twice the force of the 338 Lapua. But Arya's body absorbed it with practiced efficiency, staying on target, watching through the scope as the bullet traced its long arc through the storm. 3.2 seconds of flight time. At this range, you could watch your round travel, could see it fighting through wind and gravity, could witness the physics happening in real time. The thermal scope showed the impact, a brief flash of heat as kinetic energy converted to thermal. Not center mass. Not a miss. A headshot. The target's thermal signature collapsed. "Hit," Flynn breathed. "Clean headshot at 3,847 meters. Confirmed." The hide erupted in stunned silence. Reynolds stared through his spotting scope, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. "1 of 14, Arya said, already cycling the bolt, chambering the next round, wind stable, for another 80 seconds. She didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the impossible shot she'd just made. Her breathing remained controlled, her focus absolute. The first target had been proof of concept. Now came the real work. Through his thermal scope, Jackson watched the ice fortress erupt into chaos. The extremists had just seen one of their commanders drop with no warning, no sound of gunfire reaching them across the distance. They were scrambling, trying to identify the threat, pulling back from exposed positions. "They're dispersing," Garrett reported. "Moving to cover." "Expected," Arya said calmly. She was tracking a second target, a figure moving quickly across an open courtyard, probably trying to reach a sheltered entrance. Winds shifting 2 degrees, compensating. Second shot. Another 3.2-second wait. Another thermal signature collapsing. 2 for 2, Flynn confirmed, his voice carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. The extremists were panicking now. The second headshot had come from a completely different angle, impossible unless the sniper had moved, which she hadn't. They couldn't figure out the geometry, couldn't understand how they were being engaged. Third target, Arya said, moving left to right, approximately 3 meters per second, increasing lead. Reynolds was openly staring now, watching her work. Each shot was preceded by the smallest adjustments, a 1/4 mil here, a 1/2 mil there. She was reading variables he couldn't even identify. Third shot, the running figure dropped mid-stride. "This is impossible," Reynolds whispered. "The wind calculation alone." "She's not calculating," Flynn interrupted, understanding now. "She's predicting. She's so far ahead of the wind changes that she's shooting where the wind will be, not where it is. Fourth shot, fifth shot, sixth shot. Every round was finding its target. Headshots at a range where most snipers would be thrilled just to hit center mass. Arya was redefining what was possible. But then the wind shifted hard, a sudden gust that made the entire hide shudder. The storm was intensifying, the temporary stability window closing faster than predicted. Wind spike, Flynn reported. 7-5 clicks, gusting to 8-0. Arya's finger came off the trigger. She watched, waited, reading the chaos. Thermal layers breaking up, she said. The boundaries becoming unstable. This complicates things. Can you still make the shot? Jackson asked. Yes. But I need to adapt the hold for each round now. The predictive model just got a lot more complex. She chambered another round. 7 targets down, 7 to go. But now the fortress was on full alert. The remaining targets had pulled back into deeper cover, exposing only brief windows of opportunity. Target 8, Arya said. Second floor window, northeast corner. He'll expose for approximately 2 seconds when he moves to check the courtyard. How do you know he'll move? Garrett asked. Because he's their communications officer. I saw his posture, the way he's holding something against his ear. He needs to see the situation to report it accurately. He'll move. 30 seconds passed. Then, exactly as predicted, a figure appeared in the window. Arya fired. The figure dropped. 8. Flynn confirmed. She called it perfectly. But the shot had cost them. The increased wind was pushing Arya to the edge of what was physically possible. The bullet drift was now measured in meters, not centimeters. Each shot required compensation that pushed beyond standard scope adjustments. 6 targets left, Jackson said. But the storm's getting worse. We're losing the window. No, Arya said. The storm's not the problem. They're adapting. They know someone's out here now. They're going to try something. As if in response to her words, the ice fortress suddenly erupted with return fire not accurate. They didn't know where Frost 7's position was, but suppressive. Dozens of rounds chewing up the snow and ice across the valley, hoping to get lucky. They're panicking, Garrett observed. Wasting ammunition. They're creating a diversion, Arya corrected. Watch the west exit. Jackson swung his scope. 3 figures were making a break for it, using the covering fire to sprint toward a reinforced position further down the mountain. They're running, he said. They're the priority targets, Arya replied. Command structure. The others are expendable muscle. These 3 are the ones who matter. She was already adjusting, tracking the lead runner, moving target, extreme range, deteriorating conditions. This one's going to be close, she said, and fired. The bullet flew through 3 distinct layers of wind, each one trying to push it off course. Arya had accounted for all of it. The crosswind at ground level, the thermal updraft at mid-altitude, the high-altitude jet stream effect that created a final lateral push. The running target dropped. Headshot. 9. Flynn confirmed, his voice tight with tension. The second runner saw his companion fall and change direction, serpentining now, making himself harder to predict. Smart tactical movement. Would have saved him against most snipers. Arya tracked him for 2 seconds, reading his pattern, understanding the rhythm of his movements. Then she fired between his zigs and zags, timing the shot so the bullet would arrive exactly when he zagged into its path. He fell. 10. The third runner was the smartest. He'd gone to ground, taking cover behind an ice formation that provided concealment from Arya's angle. But he'd made a mistake. He'd chosen cover that would let him observe Frost 7's position, which meant eventually he'd have to expose. He's pinned, Garrett said. We can wait him out. No time, Arya replied. 4 targets still in the fortress. They're coordinating something. She was right. Through the thermal scope, Jackson could see the remaining extremists gathering, preparing for a coordinated breakout. They'd realized that staying put was death. The invisible sniper was picking them apart. Their only chance was to scatter simultaneously, gambling that she couldn't track multiple targets. They're going to rush, Jackson said. All at once. 55 seconds, Arya predicted. They're arguing about who goes first. The leader's convincing them they'll move together in 55 seconds. Reynolds checked his watch, counting down. Jackson had no idea how Arya could predict human behavior with that precision, but he wasn't betting against her anymore. 40 seconds. Arya chambered a fresh round. 30 seconds. She made a minute adjustment to her scope. 20 seconds. Her breathing deepened, slowed. 10 seconds. At exactly 55 seconds, 4 figures burst from different exits of the fortress simultaneously, sprinting in different directions. Arya fired. The westernmost runner dropped headshot. She cycled the bolt faster than Jackson thought possible, swung to the second target. Fired. Headshot. Bolt. Swing. Fire. Headshot. 3 shots in 8 seconds. 3 headshots at 3,800 meters. The fourth target was still running, had gained the most distance, was nearly to cover that would protect him from Arya's line of sight. She tracked him, leading the shot, compensating for his speed, the distance, the wind that had shifted again. Her finger brushed the trigger. The shot cracked out. 3.3 seconds of flight. The runner was 2 steps from cover when he collapsed. 13, Flynn said, his voice carrying something like religious awe. 13 headshots. 13 for 13. The valley fell silent except for the wind. Somewhere out there, the final target, the runner who'd gone to ground behind ice cover, was still hiding, still alive. One left, Jackson said. The patient one, Arya replied. He's not running. He's waiting for us to think we've won, waiting for us to relax our guard. Can you see him? No. But I know where he is, and I know he'll eventually have to move. The ice he's hiding behind is unstable. I saw microfractures when he dove behind it. The storm's eroding it. In approximately 4 minutes, it'll collapse, and he'll have to relocate. You saw microfractures from 3,800 meters away? The way light refracted through the ice. Small variation, but distinct. She settled deeper into her shooting position. We wait. The team waited. The storm howled. Time stretched. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, exactly as Arya had predicted, the ice formation began to crumble. The hidden target bolted, sprinting for new cover. Arya's shot was already in motion before he'd taken his second step. She predicted not just when he'd move, but where, had understood that his new cover options were limited, had known which route he'd choose. The bullet caught him mid-stride. 14, Flynn said quietly. 14 headshots. 41 seconds from first target to last. No misses. The fortress was silent now. Thermal scopes showed no remaining signatures. The mission was complete. Reynolds slowly stood, walked to where Arya remained in shooting position. He looked at her, then at the rifle, then back at her. That's not possible, he said. What you just did, it violates every principle of long-range shooting. The wind alone should have made it impossible. The distance, the cold, the moving targets. Arya finally lifted her head from the scope. Her face was calm, showing no sign of triumph or satisfaction. It's possible, she said simply, when you stop fighting the wind and start listening to it. The extraction helicopter was still 30 minutes out. Frost 7 held their position, maintaining overwatch on the silent fortress. Jackson filed his preliminary report via encrypted satellite link, trying to find words that would make his commanders believe what had just happened. Confirmed 14 hostile KIA, all headshots, range 3,800 to 3,900 meters, extreme weather conditions, total engagement time 41 seconds. He read it back to himself. It sounded like fiction. Arya had moved away from the rifle, was breaking down her equipment with methodical precision. Flynn approached her carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal they didn't want to spook. Ma'am, he said, I've been a spotter for 11 years, worked with some of the best shooters in the world. What you just did, I need to understand it, not just watch it, understand it. Arya paused in her work. What specifically? The moving targets. You were leading them, but not using standard calculations. You were predicting where they'd be 3 seconds in the future, accounting for wind that would shift during the bullet's flight, compensating for factors I couldn't even identify. How? She considered the question. Pattern recognition. Every person moves in patterns, even when they think they're being random. Your brain is designed to see those patterns. It's how our ancestors hunted for hundreds of thousands of years. Modern training teaches you to ignore that instinct, to rely on formulas and calculations instead. She pulled out her notebook, showed him pages of sketches, not ballistic tables, but drawings of human movement, wind patterns, terrain features. I spent 2 years studying how people move under stress, how wind behaves in mountain terrain, how temperature inversions form and break apart. I filled 30 notebooks like this, and then I stopped looking at the notebooks, because by that point, the patterns were in here. She tapped her temple. Your conscious mind can't process it. Too slow, too analytical. But your subconscious can integrate thousands of variables in milliseconds. Reynolds had joined them, listening. So, you're saying it's intuition? No. Intuition is guessing. This is trained prediction based on pattern recognition that's become automatic. Like how you can catch a ball without calculating its trajectory, your brain does the math subconsciously because you've practiced it thousands of times. But you had to account for wind changes during the bullet's flight, Reynolds pressed. 3-second flight time. The wind shifted twice during some of those shots. I watched it happen. I wasn't accounting for the wind as it was, Arya explained. I was predicting what it would become. The wind changes aren't random. They follow patterns based on temperature, pressure gradients, terrain features. If you study it long enough, you can feel when a shift is coming. Jackson rejoined the group. I sent the after-action report. Command's response was skeptical. They don't believe it? Garrett asked. They believe the targets are dead. Thermal imagery confirms it. But they're having trouble accepting the methodology. Jackson looked at Arya. They want you to replicate it. Controlled conditions, observers, scientific documentation. No. The flat refusal surprised them all. Ma'am, they're offering to reinstate you fully. Clear your record from the previous incident. They want to build a training program around your methods. You can't teach what I do in a training program, Arya said. It took me 2 years of isolation, obsession, and 10,000 practice shots to develop this skill. You can't compress that into a curriculum. And the moment you turn it into a system, you lose what makes it work, the intuitive understanding that comes from complete immersion. So no one else can learn this? Reynolds asked, and there was genuine disappointment in his voice. I didn't say that. I said you can't teach it in a conventional program. Arya finished packing her gear. But if someone wants to spend years in these mountains, shooting in every possible condition, filling notebooks with observations, learning to hear what the wind is saying, then yes, they can learn it. Flynn laughed quietly. So the answer is basically become obsessed to the point of madness. That's one way to put it. Arya's expression softened slightly. After Nathan died, because I trusted my equipment over my instincts, I couldn't let it go. Couldn't move on. So I came back here and I learned everything. Not so I could be a better sniper, but so I could understand what went wrong. Turns out, when you spend that much time studying one thing, you get very good at it. The helicopter's rotors became audible in the distance, fighting through the storm. What happened to Nathan? Jackson asked quietly. The official report was classified. Arya was silent for a long moment. We were tracking a high-value target in the Afghan mountains. Winter storm, conditions similar to tonight. I had a shot 2,900 meters. My ballistic computer said the wind call was good. My instruments said the temperature compensation was correct. Everything said take the shot. She stared at the distant fortress where 14 bodies now lay. But something felt wrong. The wind sounded different than what my instruments were reading. I should have trusted that feeling. Instead, I trusted the technology. I took the shot. Missed. The target security team triangulated our position from the muzzle flash. Nathan was our rear security. They hit him first. That wasn't your fault, Reynolds said. Equipment failure. It was exactly my fault. Not because the equipment failed, but because I had stopped trusting myself. I'd become dependent on technology to tell me what I should have been able to feel. Her voice was steady, but Jackson heard the old pain beneath it. So I gave up technology. Learned to read the wind the way people did before we had anemometers and ballistic computers, and I never missed again. The helicopter touched down, rotors still spinning, ready for immediate extraction. Let's move, Jackson ordered. As they loaded into the aircraft, Frost 7 taking their positions, Jackson caught one last glimpse of the fortress through the storm. 14 impossible shots. 14 headshots that broke every rule of physics and probability. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard through the blizzard. Arya sat quietly in the corner, her rifle case beside her, looking out at the mountains she'd made her home and her teacher. They were 90 seconds into the flight when the radio crackled with an emergency broadcast. All units, be advised, secondary explosive devices detected at target location. Remote detonation imminent. Recommend immediate. The transmission cut off as a massive explosion lit up the valley below. The ice fortress, what remained of it, erupted in a fireball that turned night into day. But it wasn't just the fortress. The extremists had rigged the entire mountain face with charges. Avalanche, the pilot shouted. Massive avalanche, multiple vectors. Through the helicopter's windows, Jackson watched in horror as entire sections of the mountain began to move. Thousands of tons of snow and ice, destabilized by the explosion, were cascading down into the valley. The valley where 3 other NATO teams were positioned. Frost 8, Frost 9, Frost 10. Jackson transmitted on the emergency channel. Emergency extraction, immediate. Avalanche incoming on your positions. Static, then broken transmissions, voices tight with panic. Can't reach the LZ. Buried. We're completely. Need immediate support. Avalanche has cut off. The pilot was already banking hard, fighting the helicopter through winds that had intensified from the explosion's thermal bloom. Sir, I can't maintain altitude in these thermals. We need to get clear of the blast zone. Negative, Jackson snapped. We've got 3 teams trapped down there. Get us as close as you can. Commander, the avalanche is still active. If we go down there, that's an order. The helicopter dove toward the chaos. Through the swirling snow and debris, Jackson could see the scope of the disaster. The avalanche had created multiple debris fields, each one potentially burying personnel and equipment. We need a search pattern, Garrett said, already pulling out thermal imaging gear. Spread out, look for heat signatures under the snow. No time for systematic search, Arya said suddenly. She was at the door, looking down at the devastated landscape with clinical assessment. The avalanche followed predictive patterns based on the terrain. I can narrow down where they'd be. Jackson stared at her. You can predict where an avalanche deposited people? Not exactly where. But I can eliminate 90% of the search area. She pointed to a section of the valley. The primary flow would have followed that drainage. Anyone caught there is either dead or too deep to reach in time. But there she indicated a smaller side valley that's a pressure shadow. Lower velocity deposition. If anyone survived with a chance of rescue, they're there. That's a guess, Reynolds said. It's an educated prediction based on avalanche dynamics. Arya was already rigging a rappel line, and it's better than random searching. Put me down there, I'll find them. The pilot brought them as close as he dared, still 30 feet above the unstable snow. Arya went down the line without hesitation, dropping into a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Snow formations twisted into bizarre shapes by the violence of the avalanche, pressure ridges, and debris fields. She's insane, Flynn muttered. She's our best chance, Jackson replied. He keyed his radio. Hale, what do you see? Arya was already moving, reading the snow like it was a text written in a language only she understood. The deposition pattern shows 3 distinct impact zones. The deepest snow is here, she kicked at a drift, testing its stability, but it's consolidated. Too hard. No one's buried here and still breathing. She moved to a second area, dropping to her knees, pressing her ear against the snow. What's she doing? Garrett asked. Listening, Jackson realized. She's listening for them. 30 seconds passed. Then, here, I've got breathing sounds. 2, maybe 3 people. Depth approximately 2 meters. The helicopter couldn't land, the snow was too unstable, but they could drop equipment. Jackson organized the team into a rapid response. Rappel down, dig out the buried personnel, stabilize them, evacuate. It took 17 minutes of desperate work, the whole time aware that the mountain could shift again at any moment. They pulled out 4 members of Frost 9, all alive, all suffering from hypothermia and crush injuries but survivable. 2 more teams, Jackson said as they loaded the casualties. We need to keep searching. Northeast sector, Arya said, already moving. Different avalanche vector. Follow me. For the next 2 hours, Arya led them through the disaster zone, predicting where the avalanche physics would have deposited survivors, eliminating search areas that would waste precious time. She found Frost 8 trapped in an ice cave created by the avalanche debris, 5 personnel, 3 injured. Frost 10 was harder, The avalanche had carried them nearly a kilometer down the valley, scattering the team. But Arya tracked them by reading the debris field like a map, understanding how the avalanche would have sorted the debris by size and weight, predicting that human bodies would end up in specific zones within that sorting pattern. They found 7 of Frost 1's 8 members. The 8th Petty Officer, First Class Derek Martinez, was still missing. "We're running out of time," the pilot warned. "Fuel's at 20%. We need to extract in the next 15 minutes or we're not making it back to base." "One more," Jackson said. "We're not leaving Martinez." "He could be anywhere," Reynolds argued. "We've searched the probable zones." "The probable zones based on normal avalanche dynamics," Arya corrected. "But this wasn't a normal avalanche. The explosion created abnormal pressure waves. There's one more zone, unlikely, but possible." She pointed to a section of the valley that looked completely wrong. The snow had formed an unusual elevated mound, when logic said it should be a depression. "That's a reverse flow formation," she said. "Happens when the avalanche hits a terrain feature that deflects the flow upward. Rare, but possible. If Martinez was in the right position when the avalanche hit, the reverse flow could have carried him there." "That's a lot of ifs," Garrett said. "It's all we've got left." They had 10 minutes. Arya sprinted across the unstable snow, moving with a confidence that defied the treacherous terrain. Jackson and Reynolds followed, carrying emergency medical gear. At the mound, Arya dropped to her knees again, listening. Jackson saw her face change, hope flashing across her normally neutral expression. "He's here. Shallow burial, maybe 1 meter. He's still breathing, but it's weak." They dug with everything they had, bare hands when the shovels became useless, ignoring the cold that burned their exposed skin. 8 minutes. 7 minutes. At 5 minutes, they broke through to Martinez. He was unconscious, hypothermic, lips blue, but alive. "Move!" Jackson shouted. The evacuation was chaos, running across unstable snow, the helicopter hovering as low as the pilot dared, Martinez being hauled up on a rescue litter, everyone knowing they were seconds from disaster. The helicopter lifted off with 90 seconds of fuel remaining, enough to make it back to base with almost nothing to spare. As they cleared the valley, Jackson looked back at the devastated landscape. 3 teams saved, 21 personnel recovered, 0 fatalities. "You predicted all of that," he said to Arya. "The avalanche patterns, the survival zones, the reverse flow formation. How?" "Same principle as the shooting," she replied, treating Martinez for hypothermia with practiced efficiency. "Pattern recognition. Physics. Understanding that chaos follows rules, you just have to learn what those rules are." Reynolds was staring at her with something like awe. "You didn't just save the mission tonight, you saved 21 lives." Arya didn't respond. She was focused on Martinez, monitoring his vital signs, keeping him alive. But Jackson saw her hand shake just slightly, just for a moment, as the adrenaline finally started to fade, and the reality of what they'd just survived began to sink in. The helicopter made it back to base with fuel gauges reading 0. The pilot shut down the engines and just sat there for a moment, processing how close they'd come to going down in the mountains. The base erupted into organized chaos, medical teams rushing to treat the hypothermic and injured, intelligence officers demanding debriefs, officers trying to understand what had happened in the valley. Jackson stayed with his team as they moved Martinez and the other casualties to the medical facility. The doctors took over, immediately beginning aggressive rewarming protocols. "He's going to make it," the lead physician said after 20 minutes. "Another 5 minutes in that snow and we'd be having a different conversation. But he'll survive." Jackson allowed himself to feel the relief. 21 for 21, everyone coming home. He found Arya in the operations center, standing in front of a topographic map of the valley, studying it with the same intense focus she'd brought to everything else tonight. "They want to give you a medal," he said. "I don't want a medal." "I know, but you're getting one anyway. What you did tonight, both the shooting and the rescue, it's going to be studied for years. They'll write manuals about it. Teach it at every special operations school." "They won't teach anything useful," Arya replied, still studying the map. "Because they'll try to systematize it, turn it into procedures and checklists. But that's not how it works." Jackson moved to stand beside her. "Then how does it work? You spend so much time in a place, studying it, learning it, failing at it, that eventually you and the place become the same thing. You stop thinking about the mountains, you think like the mountains." You stop predicting the wind, you become the wind. She traced a finger along the valley contours. That's not something you can teach in a classroom. But you could teach people to develop that relationship, that connection. Maybe, if they're willing to give up everything else for it. She finally looked at him. Is that what you want? To create more people like me? Who can shoot 14 headshots at 3,800 meters, but can't hold a normal conversation? Who can predict avalanche patterns, but can't sleep without nightmares? The honesty was brutal. Jackson had no immediate answer. I'm not well adjusted, Arya continued. I'm functional. There's a difference. What I can do comes from obsession bordering on pathology. From spending 2 years in isolation because I couldn't face normal life after getting someone killed. From turning grief and guilt into a singular focus that excluded everything else. Nathan's death wasn't your fault. It was exactly my fault. I made a choice to trust technology over instinct. That choice killed him. The fact that I've turned that guilt into something useful doesn't make it less my fault. She turned back to the map, but I promised I'd never make that mistake again. Tonight, I kept that promise. 14 shots, 21 rescues, 0 mistakes. That has to be enough. Garrett entered the operations center, saw them by the map. Commander, Colonel Henderson wants a full debrief. And there's a journalist here somehow got cleared to be on base asking about the miracle rescue. Jackson's expression darkened. No journalists. This stays classified. Tell that to the colonel. He thinks this is a good news story, wants to highlight the success. It's not a story, Arya said quietly. It's just what happened. But Jackson could already see the trajectory, the media attention, the analysis, the attempts to understand and replicate what Arya had done. They'd turn her into something she wasn't, a symbol, a hero, a case study. I'm leaving, Arya said, making the decision in an instant. Tonight, before this becomes something it shouldn't be. You can't just leave. You're still on duty status. Watch me. She was already moving, gathering the minimal gear she'd brought. Jackson followed her into the hallway. If you leave now, they'll come after you. Questions, investigations, mandatory psychological evaluations. They won't let this go. Then I'll give them what they need to let me go. She stopped, turned to face him. I'll do one debrief. Complete, detailed, everything they want to know. But then I'm done. I go back to the mountains, back to being alone, and they leave me alone. That's the deal. I can't promise that. Then I'm leaving anyway. Jackson considered his options. Arya had just saved 21 lives and completed an impossible mission. She had leverage, whether she recognized it or not. I'll make the deal, he said. One debrief. Complete cooperation. Then you walk away. And we don't contact you, unless it's a situation like tonight, something that requires your specific skills. Emergency use only. And between emergencies, you disappear. We don't track you, don't monitor you, don't bother you. You want to spend the next 10 years alone in these mountains, that's your choice. Arya studied him, weighing whether to trust the offer. Why would you do that? She asked. Because what you can do is too valuable to lose completely. But I understand it comes from a place we can't replicate. Better to have you available for emergencies than to destroy you trying to turn you into something you're not. She nodded slowly. One debrief. Tonight. Then I'm gone. The debrief took 4 hours. Colonel Henderson, 2 intelligence analysts, a ballistics expert, and a psychologist, all trying to understand what had happened in the valley. Arya walked them through everything. The wind analysis, the ballistic calculations she'd made subconsciously, the pattern recognition that had led to the avalanche rescue predictions. She drew diagrams, showed her notebooks, explained her methodology in detail that should have been impossible to articulate. But even as she explained it, Jackson could see the frustration on the analysts' faces. They were trying to reduce her ability to a formula, a system they could teach to others. And the more she explained, the clearer it became that this wasn't something you could systematize. So, the wind prediction, one analyst said, you're saying you can hear patterns in the sound of the wind that correlate to specific atmospheric conditions? Yes, but you can't define those patterns specifically? Can't create an audio database that others could reference? No, because every mountain creates different acoustic patterns, every valley, every weather system. You have to learn each place individually. And the shooting itself, you made 14 headshots at extreme range, using what you're calling intuitive compensation. But you can't break down exactly what you were compensating for? I can break it down, Arya replied patiently. Wind drift based on multi-layer flow patterns, Coriolis effect, modified by the Eötvös effect, thermal boundary transitions, spin drift, powder burn rate variations due to extreme cold, barrel harmonics affected by temperature. I can list every variable. What I can't do is explain how I processed all of them in the fraction of a second between acquiring the target and pulling the trigger. Your brain was performing calculations too fast for conscious awareness? Not calculations. Pattern matching. My brain recognized the total gestalt of conditions and matched it to similar situations I'd encountered before, making micro-adjustments based on previous experience. The psychologist leaned forward. And you built this pattern database through 2 years of isolated practice in mountain environments? Yes. During which you were experiencing symptoms consistent with PTSD, depression, and obsessive-compulsive behavior? Jackson tensed. This was the dangerous part of the debrief, where they'd try to declare her psychologically unfit. But Arya didn't flinch. Yes, I used those symptoms productively. The obsessive focus helped me spend 12 hours a day practicing. The depression removed distractions. I had no interest in anything except understanding what had gone wrong with Nathan. The PTSD nightmares meant I wasn't sleeping anyway, so I might as well be productive. That's not healthy coping, the psychologist said. I didn't say it was healthy. I said it was productive. Arya's voice remained calm. You asked me how I developed these skills. That's the answer. If you're looking for a mentally healthy methodology that produces the same results, I can't help you. Silence in the room. Finally, Colonel Henderson spoke. Miss Hale, I want to be clear. The military values your contributions tonight. 14 confirmed hostile eliminations, 21 personnel rescued. That's extraordinary. But we also have a duty of care to our personnel. If you're not psychologically stable, I'm stable enough to function, Arya interrupted. I successfully completed an impossible mission and a complex rescue operation. My methods may be unconventional, but the results speak for themselves. For how long? How long can you sustain this before it breaks you completely? I don't know. Maybe it already has broken me. And what you're seeing is what functional looks like for someone who's broken. She met Henderson's eyes. But I'm offering you a deal. I'll be available for situations that require my specific skills. Emergency use only. In exchange, you leave me alone the rest of the time. Don't try to fix me. Don't try to study me. Don't try to turn me into something I'm not. Henderson looked at Jackson, who nodded slightly. They discussed this possibility. This would be an unusual arrangement, Henderson said. Completely outside normal protocols. Everything about tonight has been outside normal protocols, Arya replied. Another long pause, then Henderson nodded. Agreed, but with conditions. You check in monthly, just a brief communication confirming you're alive and functional. And you maintain a secure line that we can use to contact you for emergencies, once every 3 months. And I define what constitutes an emergency worthy of contact. Every 2 months. And we both have input on what constitutes an emergency. Arya considered, then nodded. Acceptable. They spent another hour working out the logistics, the communication protocols, the conditions under which she could be activated. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the mountains, pale light filtering through the storm that had finally started to diminish. Jackson walked Arya out to the helicopter pad, where a transport was waiting to take her wherever she wanted to go. Where will you go? He asked. North. There's a valley about 200 kilometers from here. No one lives there. Good hunting, good fishing, mountains all around. I can practice there without being disturbed. Practice for what? The next impossible shot. She smiled slightly, the first smile Jackson had seen from her. There's always a next impossible shot. And if we need you, you know how to reach me. But make sure it's worth the interruption. I don't like being disturbed. She climbed into the helicopter. Jackson stepped back as the rotors spun up. Through the window, he saw her looking out at the mountains, her face already shifting from the focused intensity of the mission to something more distant, more solitary. The helicopter lifted off, banking toward the northern peaks. Reynolds came to stand beside Jackson, watching it disappear into the lightning sky. "She's the best I've ever seen," Reynolds said quietly. "And the loneliest?" "Sometimes those things go together," Jackson replied. "Do you think she'll actually check in? Or just disappear completely?" "She'll check in. She keeps her promises." Jackson turned back toward the operations center. "Besides, she knows we'll need her again. Someone who can do what she does. The world's going to keep creating situations that require impossible shots." "The white ghost of 3,800 meters, Reynolds quoted. "That's what the intel reports are calling her." "She won't like that." "No, but it's accurate. She's a ghost now, gone. Until the next time someone needs the impossible." 3 months later, Jackson received a message through the secure line. No text, just a photograph. A shooting target at extreme range, 14 holes in the center. The timestamp showed it had been taken just hours earlier. Her way of checking in. 6 months later, another message. This time a short video. A valley covered in fresh snow, wind howling through the peaks, and the distant crack of a rifle shot echoing between the mountains. No context, no explanation. Just proof she was still there, still practicing, still preparing for the next impossible task. The legend grew in the special operations community. Operators would tell the story of the night a female sniper had made 14 headshots at 3,800 meters in a Category 9 blizzard, then rescued 21 personnel from an avalanche by reading snow patterns like they were written in a language only she understood. Some people said it was exaggerated. That distance was impossible. That wind couldn't be predicted that accurately. That one person couldn't possibly have predicted avalanche deposition zones with that precision. But the people who'd been there knew the truth. They'd seen her work. They'd been saved by her predictions. Reynolds started training differently after that night. He still used ballistic computers and wind meters, but he also started going to the range in bad weather. Started trying to hear what the wind was saying, feel what the terrain was teaching. He never got close to Arya's level. No one did. But he got better, more intuitive, more connected to the environment. Others did the same. A quiet shift in how certain operators approached their craft, moving away from pure technology and towards something more holistic. They didn't talk about it openly, didn't want to sound mystical or unscientific, but they knew. There was something beyond the calculations, beyond the equipment, something Arya had tapped into that conventional training couldn't reach. The training facility where she'd been stationed before the mission started, including her notebooks in their curriculum, not as gospel, but as inspiration. Examples of what obsessive study and pattern recognition could achieve. They couldn't teach students to become Arya Hale, but they could encourage them to find their own version of that deep connection with their craft. And in a valley 200 kilometers north of the Karsden Range, Arya continued her solitary practice. Every day, in every condition, pushing the limits of what was possible, not for glory or recognition, but because it was what she needed to do, what Nathan's death had driven her to become. Sometimes she thought about that night, the 14 shots, the rescue, the brief moment when she'd been part of a team again. But mostly she thought about the next shot, the next challenge, the next impossible distance, because that's what legends do. They keep practicing, keep perfecting, keep pushing beyond what anyone believes is possible. Until the next time the mountains call her name. Until the next impossible shot needs to be made. And then the white ghost of 3,800 meters will return from the cold, make the shot no one else can make, and disappear back into the winter from which she came. Not a hero, not a symbol. Just a woman who learned to listen to the wind, who turned grief into skill, who found in solitude what she could never find in company. The absolute mastery of her craft, and the peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you can do. The story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, because for Arya Hale, the story never really ends. It just pauses between impossible shots, waiting for the next storm, the next mountain, the next chance to prove that what seems impossible is merely difficult for those who know how to listen. And in the mountains, the wind still whispers its secrets to those patient enough to learn its language.